Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this, the final event in the 2022 series of public events from the Tax Justice Network. We are delighted for this event to be partnering with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which you may know is the umbrella body for mass mobilization organizations working in this space. The theme of this event is the golden opportunity of the UN Tax Convention. And we'll be talking a lot more about why that is such a golden opportunity. But let me begin with a little bit of housekeeping. To let you know, we have, as in each event in the series, we have interpretation available to English, Spanish, and French. And the speakers in this main event will speak in English and in Spanish. So to listen in your preferred language, just click the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and choose the language that you want to follow along in. The reason this event is at the end of our series, and the reason we postponed this from before the summer now to September, is because in a sense the UN Tax Convention represents the culmination of a great deal of work and a great deal of the policy effort in this space, and it picks up on each of the other events in the series. Now, rather than the usual annual conference that we tend to have, we've designed this event series this year precisely because there are these key opportunities. So we had the launch of the Financial Secrecy Index 2022, which for the first time in about a decade put the United States in #1 position as the biggest global threat in terms of the financial secrecy that generates illicit financial flows, including cross-border tax abuse all around the world. We then had an event focused on the global asset register, this idea for a comprehensive register or a linking up of different registers of the beneficial ownership of companies, of financial accounts, other legal entities, and so on, in order to end the scourge of anonymous wealth that underpins all illicit financial flows, including, for example, making sanctions almost impossible to enforce also. And then we looked at the OECD's corporate tax reforms. Really already at that stage in June, you could see we're in disarray. What had been announced the previous October as having been delivered turns out not to have been delivered at all. We're now seeing the United States unlikely even to support that. The EU may support one or perhaps both pillars, but perhaps not. And we're seeing a return to digital services taxes because of the failure to get agreement on what a comprehensive reform would look like. Now, this event around a UN tax convention, as I say, is in some sense the culmination of all of those agendas. Globally, we estimate with the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and with Public Services International in the State of Tax Justice report that the revenue losses worldwide to cross-border tax abuse are of the order of $483 billion. Let's call it $500 billion. And that's being lost both to the tax abuse of multinational companies and to individuals hiding their wealth and income streams offshore. Now, that imposes enormous losses on all of our societies, both in terms of the foregone revenues that could have paid for public services and administration, but also the foregone opportunities to redistribute, because of course the taxes that are being cheated there are the taxes that do most of the redistribution, the taxes on income, profits, capital gains, and wealth. So the effect is we have worse public services, weaker governments, and higher inequality because of the failures of tax injustice. And the OECD process, as I say, is really falling apart, I think, now with increasingly little prospect of anything coming into action. But the alternative that picks up both international standards of transparency and cooperation, and importantly, the setting of future tax rules, is seen in the proposals for a UN tax convention that we're going to talk about today. A convention that has the possibility not just to set rigorous and ambitious international standards, but also to create the intergovernmental tax body that could, for the first time, put all countries on an equal setting for a genuinely inclusive rule-making body to finally get us to the position where companies pay tax in the same place that they make their money, and where individuals face a similar position because of the elimination of financial secrecy. So today we have, in a sense, two elements to help us through this and talk about the details of what's coming. Firstly, we have an expert panel of civil society speakers, all of whom have been deeply engaged in this work over many years, including particularly around the convention, and we'll hear their views on the convention itself, the substance of it, and the politics, how we may get there. And then we'll move to a second stage where we're honoured to have speakers from Colombia and Norway, from their governments, who are engaging in this important question. In fact, both speakers have been for a significant period of time and can give us their perspectives on where this is, where this has the potential to go, and where we may see things move in fact in the next quite short period. So I'll introduce people as we go along. Let me begin though with the expert panel that we'll start with, and we'll ask each of the speakers here to talk for perhaps 7 or so minutes, and then we'll move into a Q&A. And for that, you have, again, a button at the bottom of the screen. I'm sure you're all familiar with this by now, where you can leave questions, and in the discussion afterwards, we'll try and get through as many of those as we reasonably can. So that the 3 panelists we have in this first session are the following. We have Alvin Musioma, who's the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa, indeed has been since its founding in 2007. And Alvin has been working very closely with policymakers across the region. And it's no coincidence that the biggest step forward we've had, which I'm sure Alvin will address, is the ministerial declaration from the Economic Commission for Africa conference in May this year, where effectively more than a quarter of United Nations member states called for the beginning of negotiations on a UN tax convention. The speakers we'll hear from later, from Colombia and Norway, will, I hope, talk about the prospects for support from their regions for this important leadership. After Alvin, we'll hear from Tove Riding, who's the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Eurodad, very closely involved with Tax Justice Europe, of course, another of the regional networks. And also, importantly, Tove is the author of a draft UN tax convention that's been published for comment by Eurodad and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. And Tove can really talk to some of the details, some of the potential to deliver in substantive areas that the convention offers us. And lastly, within that panel, we'll hear from Derege Alamayehu, who's the Executive Coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and really, in some sense, has an overview of both the politics and the mobilizations across this space, and can give us some steer on where the global movement's thinking is on this, and perhaps where we're going in really potentially quite an immediate process that we're just going into now with the UN General Assembly. So let me, with that, hand over to Alvin as the first speaker. And Alvin, please, if you can give us your sense of, how we arrived at this point of crucial African leadership on this issue, and the potential that you see now, both for African states and civil society, to take this forward, and perhaps what you might ask the rest of us to do to start pulling our weight too. Over to you, Albert.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex, for the kind introduction. I think, as you said in the beginning remarks, that we are, when it comes to the process towards a global tax body, at a watershed moment. I think finally we have a single opportunity to put in place a global framework that addresses the structural problem with the global tax reforms, and which is really as a result of dominance of rich countries that we have seen historically. So first point I would like to make is that it's not that there has been no demands for effort towards a global tax convention and that the precursor for the global tax body, but it's more because those that are resisting or blocking these efforts tend to be, although few, to be more powerful and have a more stronger hold on the decision-making process, which really re-emphasizes the need for this conversation. And from an African perspective, I think what we have seen over the last 10 years that African countries have been at the forefront in terms of providing leadership, in terms of what the kind of global reforms that are needed to be undertaken to tackle illicit financial flows, which the African continent continues to bear the largest brand. We go back to 2015 in Addis. We saw African countries, despite the resistance from rich countries, providing very credible leadership and pushing back, which really resulted to the role that the issue of illicit financial flows received in the SDG conversation. So what we can say here is that we have had successes in terms of the effort by African countries to push in terms of the prominence of the illicit financial flows within the context of the SDG discussion, despite the resistance and the pushback of some blocking countries that want to continue perpetuating the status quo. Now, I think once again we stand at a similar situation where we have seen African countries coming together and in one voice issuing a declaration where they are demanding the start of a negotiation towards the establishment of a tax convention as a precursor to the global tax convention. The question is what we do with that would require a global effort, a global pulling together. When you ask what the rest of us can be able to do, I think that the effort, the trainers, so to say, left the station. The question is what will be supporting countries be doing to support this effort as Tax Justice Network, recognizing the opportunity that this demand by African finance ministers presented. We started a campaign in collaboration with other civil society organizations from across the globe to support the endorsement of this resolution. And as a result of that, we have managed to generate over 220 signatures in support from across over 100 civil society organizations that are coming in and supporting the call by the African finance ministers meeting, the African finance meeting that happened in May in Dakar. I think it is really important to underscore that that the demand for the global tax reform, while it has been articulated and led by African countries, both in the context of the SDG, but also now in the context of the global tax body, it is a global demand. We have seen the global southern countries organized under the G7 and China coming out very clearly to support this demand. We saw the fact panel in its report also coming out and saying that this will be an important step, which really emphasizes the point that it is not the lack of demand, it is really the resistance which we need to be broken, particularly by countries that are enjoying the status quo. We believe that the reforms that needs to be done towards creating an equitable outcome would only happen if we take advantage of the opportunity that has been presented, because if you have a failed process, then obviously the outcome of that failed process will be influenced by that, and therefore our push as Tax Network Africa, in collaboration with other civil society organizations, both in Africa but across the world, is really looking at, as we gear up to the meeting that is up, the UNHC meeting happening in September. What are those quick wins can we be able to achieve in terms of ensuring that there's a strong language emanating out of New York in support of the demands that have been made by African countries in regard to the UN Tax Convention.
Thanks, Alvin. If I can perhaps push you on one thing quickly, and we'll come back in the Q&A, but I just would like to ask you one question before we move on just now. We've heard that there was the possibility of a heads of state side event at the General Assembly. And that seems, according to the rumour mill, to be less likely now. And the idea was that would have been hosted by either the African Union or indeed Senegal. Now, I don't know if, one of the rumours was that there'd been pressure from the OECD not to go ahead with this because presumably they want to keep focus on their corporate tax reforms. But I don't know if you've heard anything of that.
Well, I will not be to be caught sort of peddling unconfirmed information. But what we can say for sure that we have known how rich countries, OECD, actually act anytime there are these kind of opportunities that come in. The divide and rule always has been the favorite tool in the box. So anytime we have seen African countries coming together to kind of develop a common position on any specific issues, there have been then efforts by OECD specifically to try and undermine that effort. So while we cannot confirm, it would not suppress me that those efforts are there would be efforts seriously to try and undermine such a process.
Thanks, Alvin. Look, we'll come back with more questions in the Q&A, but for now, let me turn to Tova Riding, who can talk to us, I hope, about your draft convention, some of the substantive issues in that convention and the possibilities that opens up, and perhaps if you have a sense of the kind of early reactions that's already had, it would be interesting to share.
Yes, thank you so much, Alvin, and thank you so much, Alex. It's really great to have this event. It's an exciting discussion, and it's always great the company to be in. While governments are not managing the global cooperation, I think civil society we're having a much more interesting and cooperative dialogue, and it's a pleasure to be part of. And indeed, we send out a proposal for what a UN tax convention could look like. We sent it out in March this year. And normally when someone sends out a proposal, I think they try to say, look, this is innovative and this is something very new and never seen before. And I think we're trying to say the opposite. We're trying to say, actually, there's nothing in here that hasn't been done before. Luckily, we have decades and decades of examples of how truly global cooperation can happen. The United Nations produces global conventions for a living, and we have it for desertification, we have it for migratory birds, we have it for tobacco control, you name it. We have so many conventions already. So what we did was actually to plow through the different types of conventions and also try to look at what are the best case examples for global cooperation. And then we applied it to tax. And when you go into the world of tax, suddenly the idea of truly global cooperation is actually new. Although we're just copying what's happening in other places, it does not exist on tax issues at the moment. As we hear this discussion again and again, of course, we know that the OECD has produced some new proposals for rules, and it seems that not even the OECD countries stand by the OECD agreements. And we had 4 developing countries that walked out already last year at the last meeting. Instead of adopting the conclusions, we had Kenya, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan not sign on to the outcome. And over a third of the world's countries never were part of the negotiations at all. So we don't have it for tax, and we pay a very heavy price for that. The lack of cooperation means we have a world of tax havens, of countries coming out with their own proposals and ideas and trying to do their own national solutions. And it's put us in this absurd situation where we're all losing out. But we also sometimes have an odd agreement between civil society and big multinational corporations on this one point, is that the tax system is a chaos and everyone's fed up with it. And so what the convention tries to do is to say, well, if we try to learn from the other areas, what are the basics that we can start by putting in place? The first one is the idea of having a global decision-making body. I think anyone who's worked on climate would find it hard to imagine how to do the global climate change process without having the conference of the parties. That's where the world's governments get together every year. They discuss where we're at, where we're going. They make decisions. It's heated, it's intense, but we have a place where we can go and demand that governments take action. It's a hugely important space, both for government accountability, but also just for democracy and for the media to find out where we're at. We have this global space. So the first and obvious thing to write into our UN Tax Convention was, of course, the idea of setting up a conference of the parties. So that was pretty much a no-brainer. We also have the element of transparency there. We've actually seen a lot of great initiatives on tax already. We have, for multinational corporations, we have something called country-by-country reporting. It's a type of transparency, and we have automatic information exchange. We have some good standards. It's just that we don't have a commitment to make sure that all countries really benefit from this transparency and that we use the best standards. So the second thing we put into the convention was, of course, a transparency standard that takes all the best examples. But very importantly, this transparency is not just transparency for transparency's sake. It needs to be in a convention that has an overall objective, because otherwise we risk that any type of data is good data. It's very important to say we need this transparency for a purpose. We need transparency to make sure we can see if our tax systems are fair and we can combat illicit financial flows. And that's where a key question of the convention was really, what's this convention for? Why are we doing this? And leads you to the question, why are we taxing in the first place? And I think we all know that we need taxation to make sure that we raise public resources and promote inequality, that we fight inequality and we promote equality. So we wrote that into the convention, saying that the purpose of the convention is to make sure that we fight inequality and that governments are raising funds to fulfill their obligations. And then we mentioned human rights and environmental protection and the Sustainable Development Goals. So placing the whole issue of tax into a larger context. And that's where it's great to be in the UN system, because that's actually where we have all the other processes relating to human rights and global goals and women's rights and environmental protection. So we put that in there. And then very importantly, we looked at tax cooperation, and we have years of examples of governments, all governments of the world saying we need more tax cooperation. So we put into the convention that there should be tax cooperation. We put in a review of the way that multinational corporations are taxed. We are suggesting to replace the transfer pricing system. And again, this is perhaps it used to be a controversial position, but now it's actually something that we have a lot of different actors supporting. So we put in, let's develop a new way to tax multinational corporations. but also generally trans-border flows. How are they taxed and how should governments cooperate? How do we make sure that you don't have to pay tax on the same income in 2 different countries? We suggested that we use this global space to solve these issues. And that's where this convention, once this system starts working, it can actually start replacing the mess that we have today, because today international tax issues are sorted through thousands of bilateral tax treaties, contradictory treaties, outdated treaties. Some treaties are more than 50 years old. It's really a complete mess what we have at the moment. So the suggestion is that we put in place a global system that replaces this fantastic, complicated network that we have today. And it doesn't only mean that it becomes more consistent, it also means that for least developed countries, if they want to be part of a global tax system, they don't have to start negotiating bilateral tax treaties with all sorts of countries. They can actually be part of a global system where governments introduce global rules to replace the bilateral tax treaties. Of course, there's nothing to prevent regional and bilateral agreements in addition to all of this. And that's the important thing, is that we see this on climate and all other issues, is that the global system is not to replace the other initiatives that are going on. But if we don't have a global system, then it does get extremely messy. And I think we can find no better example of that than the global tax system that we have at the moment. And the last comment, Alex, you asked, how was this proposal received? We sent it out and we have received so much positive feedback. We're still waiting for someone to explain to us why this isn't a great idea, because it actually seems that there is a lot of support for this. And now we have the African ministers that have come out and called for a UN tax treaty. Ours is still a discussion draft, but seeing from the reception so far, it seems like there's a really, really good reason to keep this discussion going. So thank you again.
Thanks, Tove. Let me ask you one question just now as well, and then we'll come back. But I think that the point you made about the fact that we have conventions, global conventions in so many areas, and yet not this one, is a it's a point that sticks with me. And if you think, in addition, we're now operating under Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, which establish tax as the primary means of implementation for the entire framework. So there's no, I think it's probably the point in my life, at least, where there has been the strongest support or recognition for the importance of tax, revenues, redistribution, repricing of things like carbon emissions, and representation tax as the glue in the social contract. So we get it, okay? And yet we don't get a convention. We don't get that international agreement. Do you have a sense of why that is, and why now is when we're going to overcome it?
Yes, you're right. There's a huge recognition of the importance of tax. There's also a huge recognition that we need international cooperation. In fact, tax is one of the first issues that the predecessor of the UN, the League of Nations, was discussing tax 100 years ago, exactly because this mess of having people and companies move across borders immediately created tax mess. And why haven't we managed to clean it up yet? And well, I think, as I see it, we are at the end of an era, and it's good that this era is ending. It was the era where, for some reason, especially the wealthy countries had the idea that we could somehow write global tax standards and then try to get all the other countries to follow those rules. And it's a 100-year-long battle is when you split the taxing rights between two countries, who gets the taxing right? And there was this attempt, and this is what the OECD process is part of. There was the attempt to try and see, can we just write the tax rules so that we write that actually we should have most of the taxing rights here in the north? and then we'll try and get everyone else to follow it, and we'll just try and explain it's very technical and not something that other countries need to worry about. And that's failed. Not only did we not get a fair and balanced system, but actually it failed for all of us, because what we did was we created this complete mess that means that even multinational corporations are fed up with international tax matters because it's so messy and countries are just trying to get as much as they can. But this idea that it's possible to write global tax rules without a global tax body, that's the era that needs to come to an end. And the OECD's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is really an interesting debate to look at. It seems that now we're getting very, very clear signs that this current approach has failed once and for all. So it's definitely the era of global cooperation is starting right now, is actually my feeling.
Thanks, Tova. That seems like a very good point to turn to Derege and ask, Derege, I wonder, you obviously as the executive coordinator of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, you have a kind of a perspective that is necessarily global, but probably with rather more awareness of the regional variations than a lot of people with global roles. I wonder how you see both the politics of the convention and the degree to which this is a golden opportunity and how easy it may be for us to grasp it, and perhaps the extent to which you may be expecting a pushback from the OECD or others, and how that might play out politically. I think you're muted somewhere, Derege. Not muted, but maybe the headphones aren't working.
It's better now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
No, okay. Yeah.
Maybe it does not like my hands. So, okay. Actually, I had some notes, speaking notes, but the rumor you started with at the beginning could be the topic of my presentation. I'm not confirming the rumor, but I am more or less persuaded by the authenticity of the rumor from old practices. It is actually a deja vu. So just what happened in 2015 in Addis also, that the powerful countries making it a point that the paragraph in the outcome document referring to the UN, a UN tax body, should be deleted before they sit to negotiate. So now there are two things really: blocking a process within the United Nations, one, keeping the OECD at the as an illegitimate other partner of rulemaking. That is the 2 point the rich countries are driving for. So I'll not be surprised if they are still out there, out to block it again. So the whole issue is then, it is a demand of, it has been a demand of the G77, the majority of United Member States. It has now been actualized by the resolution of the African Commission. So now it is an issue of whether the United Nations will come to its original task of being the legitimate institution to solve global issues, cross-border issues, or we leave it to another powerful organization of the rich, block this democratic process, and to continue manipulating processes to its own advantage. So that is really the issue behind it. I think there is no disagreement about that. The current tax rule should be changed. If you look at the age itself, calls for a change. 100 years is a lot. The foundational principles are the same, but things have changed across the world. The way the countries which were colonized then are now independent sovereign nations. They were not part of the rulemaking. They have to be part of the new rulemaking. That is logical. How companies organize their businesses have changed. We have I heard it from Alvin once. I didn't visualize it this way. The biggest transport company in the world today does not have cars. You have a business model in which the Isle of Jersey is the biggest exporter of banana. All these things are done for tax dodging purposes. So the multinationals have organized themselves to perpetuate tax dodging. That is why they are being structured like this. So it has to change. It has to do away with this fictive structuring to get to the bottom of the problem. Inequality within and between countries is increasing because developing countries have lost their taxing rights, and domestic tax are going always in favor of reducing it for the rich and the companies and heaping it on the working peoples. For all these reasons, the change is overdue and necessary. What type of change? It is not, because it is fundamentally broken and fundamentally wrong. It has to change fundamentally. For example, the OECD tax rules, bringing in unitary apportionment for 10% of global profits and only 400 companies is really a joke. When we look at the fact that it is at the basis of profit shifting, if you reform it after 100 years to 10% of the profit, only 200, it makes it a joke. It's not a solution. The insistence on physical presence, all these things, I don't want to go into detail. It was discussed at the preceding event of the Tax Justice Network. So now, why are we, the OECD is blocking it, not delivering, but preventing the United Nations from delivering. When we say we have against this OECD domination and leadership for many reasons. The procedural ones are, the process ones are very important. The first thing is, it is a club organization. It is not a universal organization. It has no mandate to reform international tax. It had its own constitution states that it is for the advancement of the economies of its own members. It is not representing majority of countries in the global. The second one is, in any intergovernmental negotiation, the secretariat has to be neutral. You have the secretariat of a powerful institution leading an informal intergovernmental process, which blackmailing, bullying behind the scenes, but also manipulation are very evident. So there is no reason why an intergovernmental process should be led by a partisan secretariat. The other one is, in the whole process, during the inclusive framework, we have seen different phases of proposals being consulted, and it has become, the OECD process has become the Bermuda Triangle of developing country demands. Whatever they have asked, it has been disappearing. So the solutions are after. They don't address the root cause of the problem. So that is why we are saying this process is not delivering and is also being used as an excuse to block a legitimate process at the United Nations. When we say the United Nations, we are not claiming that the United Nations is perfect. On one hand, you weaken it and say it is weak. This is not a big argument against the United Nations. It's an argument to strengthen it. The second one is, for us, the fact that the process at the United Nations is open and transparent enables us to influence the outcome document and to influence also the individual position of member states as citizens, as civil society, like it happened during the climate negotiations. Now you cannot know what the OECD, what the UK position could be at the OECD negotiations. There is no open debate in the UK about it. They go and they decide. So this process, making it open, it makes it open and equal for developing countries. If it is in the UN, it will not be dominated by powerful countries. It will be transparent. There will not be, at least, open bullying and carrot and stick tactics to get their votes. It is an open process. B, it gives civil society and citizens the opportunity to influence the position of their respective governments. So what should be done now as civil society for us is really, because these things are happening behind the scene, some important decisions are in the making. The OECD is not out to solve, it is out to prevent solutions. You will have now, at one point, if they succeed, for example, in October, they can endorse what the G20 has politically agreed, and they will push countries to sign into an agreement to lock them into and create a multilateral agreement around that, a binding resolution, which will be very difficult to check off. So we have to work hard, A, to prevent this from happening. We have to persuade countries in the inclusive framework not to agree to that. And B, we have to push this process within the United Nations, A, by convincing developing countries, the G77 countries, to stand firm for that, and B, by trying to persuade some countries in the OECD, in Europe, in the US and elsewhere, support the call of a democratic decision-making process at the UN. It's not asking too much. It is just for them to abide by the rules they have agreed to when the UN was created. So we have these two tasks. One is really to support the G77 to stand firm, and the second one is to persuade and pressurize countries which are not the blockers, which are passive to enable the blockers, but which might not be blockers, to stand with developing countries and push this through the UN process. This is not done. The OECD will at least ensure keeping its monopoly of rulemaking and blocking the UN process. So the two issues are combined. Preventing them from blocking the UN process and preventing the OECD from usurping rulemaking at the international level. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sergey. Let me ask a question, because I listened to that, and the case for a fairer distribution of power, with which you would then hope to see a fairer distribution of taxing rights globally, seems absolutely clear. And we've recently seen, for example, the independent expert on foreign debt and human rights, Atiya Waris, and a group of other independent experts write to the OECD, among others, to point out just how unfair their tax proposals appear to be, and raising this question of whether we shouldn't be pursuing a UN tax convention in order to create a fairer body. If we look at it from the other side, though, from the OECD countries, is there an argument that, in a sense, we're asking them to give up power, and that's perhaps politically difficult? Or is there a more positive case to OECD countries for why this is actually in their own interests to, in a sense, give up the disproportionate power they have at the OECD in exchange for something else? What's on offer there?
I don't think, for me personally, it is a rights issue which should not be based on give and take. I know it is not about it is about a democratic principle. I'm asking them to be equals. I'm not asking them to be underprivileged or lose their rights. And if a body of countries refuses to be treated as equal and dream of becoming again colonial powers, I have nothing to give them except contempt. So that is why they have to accept equality, and then they have to accept fairness. Imagine this: the European Union Tax Observatory made a preliminary estimate of what the Pillar 2 agreement can bring different regions. It found out that even if it agreed to, it will bring 16% more revenue to rich countries and at best 2% for developing countries. Which moral can accept this? You are rich and you get more. And then imagine in fact, the second revision makes it clearly a pecking order. The distribution of the pillar 2 revenues, making the pecking order that the low-income countries are the last to benefit from. Imagine sending a delegation at the so-called international process, intergovernmental process, and bargaining to get more from the poor. So this is not a give and take. It is stop. Please recognize that the colonial era is over. There is equality of countries should negotiate in common interest. You know, I think that the negotiation process, the formulation of the 2030 agenda was really a very, very big improvement in this regard. As opposed to the MDG, it was not decided by a few selected countries. It was an inclusive process in all regions. That's why the outcome is so great. You know, the goals. And so now there is nothing to give. It is about please accept being equal and treat the rest of the world fairly. That is what I will ask them to do.
Thanks, Derje. That's pretty comprehensive. So let's go into a few broader questions now. I should flag that the Colombian Finance Minister Jose Antonio Campo is running a bit late, so we're going to change the order of the speakers after this panel, and we'll hear from the Norwegian Secretary of State of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Bjorg Sandskär, before Professor Ocampo. But we have, I think, about 15 minutes to talk through some further questions. Now that we've had some interesting questions brought up in the Q&A, so I want to go to a couple of these. One that perhaps I'll put to Tove comes in from Sol Picciotto. Sol is one of our senior advisors and an international tax lawyer of long standing. Now, Sol, with Abdul Chowdhury of the South Centre, has also been working on a proposal for a UN convention, and their thinking is very much on the lines of a framework convention. I think not at all dissimilar from your thinking, Tove. But Sol asks a question which I think is quite an important detail, and he asks if we can discuss how the proposal for UN tax convention is different from, if indeed it is, the previous attempts that have seen people push to upgrade the UN tax committee directly into a more political intergovernmental body. Is this just a version of that, or is this something more and different, would you say, Tove?
Yes, thank you so much. It's a really good question. And also, while I have the floor, thank you, Sol, for your fantastic work on the international tax systems. I think we would not have been able to analyze the flaws in the current tax system if it wasn't for all your years of fantastic work. We all learned a lot from that. And yes, thank you also for being part of this debate for a long time. How is the current debate and the latest proposal that we send out, how is it different from discussions that have already been around? The discussions actually go at least over 20 years back. The Cedillo Commission already a bit over 20 years ago suggested that there should be an international tax organization. And they didn't talk about so much should it be in the UN or outside, but the idea of having a global decision-making forum has definitely been around. And we've then seen the debate intensify also because the developing countries have become very impatient. But I think the shift in the debate now is that we're going from a very strong focus on the decision-making. It's been very focused on the basic principle, which might seem obvious, that all countries should be equal in the decision making, and it should be inclusive. And that's been very much the focus of the discussion. And then indeed, both with the South Center proposal and a number of other also more detailed calls for our UN convention, we saw the debate move towards, but how, if we have a UN tax convention as the basis for this decision making, how should this convention look like? And we tried to respond with this proposal. We tried to respond to the concern that people were asking. Yes, you talk about global tax decision making, but deciding what? And so what we tried to do was actually to say, look at all these great things that you could have. You could have global standards. You could have global cooperation. You could have tax in a context of human rights and development. So what we tried to do was to take the examples of all the great stuff you get when you have a UN convention and really hash out the details, so that we're not just discussing how decisions are made, but also start to look at, imagine if we had this, things would be so much simpler. We would have real global consensus on so many issues, and things would just be much more logical on tax. So basically, it's nothing new, but it's much more detailed, also to really get us dreaming about how many problems we could solve with the UN tax convention.
Let's all keep dreaming. I have another question from a guest, Sebastian Akbik, who's asking, and Alvin, perhaps I'll put this to you, because I think there's a context of lobbying on tax issues in African countries that this question will ring a bell with. So Sebastian's asking what the impact of corporate lobbying is on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And obviously we've seen an enormous amount of pressure from companies within the OECD process. But Sebastian wonders if we have any sense of the scale of lobbying on these efforts, including around the UN tax convention. And I think my guess is that, in a sense, this has been somewhat under the radar as far as the multinationals are concerned. So there probably hasn't been that much engagement yet, although we've certainly seen multinationals turning up within the UN system on tax issues much more often in the last 5 years. But Alvin, I mean, given that it's African finance ministers and their declaration that's really led the way on this, I wonder if you have a sense of the degree of corporate lobbying that there has been either on this particular issue or on corporate taxes in the region more generally.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. I think there are two ways. There are two ways of looking at this question of corporate lobbying. Obviously, I think when it comes to corporate taxes, we have seen across different African countries a better and more organized corporate sector that is lobbying across different departments in government, the revenue authorities, parliaments, the Ministry of Finance, to get favorable or preferential treatment in the different sectors. In the mining sector, I mean, this is public knowledge that the corporate sector, in terms of lobbying for more preferred treatment from a tax perspective, is happening. And an example in Kenya, where TGNA is based, is that the three largest, so the level of concentration of the corporate sector when it comes particularly to corporate income tax is so heavy that the four largest multinational companies contribute to about 65% of the total corporate tax income. So through that, you can imagine the kind of power they have on the executive. But when it comes to the particular process that we are discussing here, I would assume that this corporate capture is much more within the OECD, because it is the source companies that will be affected by the reforms that that are being pushed, particularly from a developing countries' perspective. So it's the Googles and the Starbucks and the Apples and all these other companies that have a much stronger hold in the reform discussions at the global level. and trying to or pushing their own countries to resist some of these efforts that we have seen this in the US, Google and others. So that I think when it comes to corporate lobbying, those will be the two dimensions that we have to unpack this discussion.
Thanks, Alvin. Daniel Bertossa from Public Services International has raised a question that I want to put to Derege. So Daniel says there's a clear moral argument for a global tax body that's inclusive of all countries, but it's less clear why such a body would actually make fair rules. There'd still be the same lobbying, there'd still be the same corporations and tax havens. And I'm reminded of a panel I was on at the EU Tax Observatory with Pascal Saint-Amans, where an academic from the University of Oxford responded to me pushing for an inclusive body by saying, look, African countries don't have any power at the OECD, but they're not actually going to have any power at the UN either if that's where tax is decided, and that's just bad luck, or words to that effect. Is that, should we actually take these views seriously? Should we, is this a counsel of despair? We can't actually hope to get to a fair system because power and the colonial legacies that underpin power matter. Should we almost not try, or just try to live within the existing power structures and make things a little bit better? What's your response on that, Derege?
Thanks, Daniel. It is not, as I said earlier, it is not because the UN is perfect or it's automatic that I'm suggesting that we are fighting for a UN process. But we have no power to stop secret deal behind the scenes. We will be confronted with a fait accompli. But if it is an open process, we can at least fight to prevent it and put government under pressure to agree to a fair deal. It is about a matter of, we can society, it is something. The only chance we have to influence an outcome is when it is an open governmental process. We have seen when negotiations are public mobilization has sometimes stopped bad deals from taking place. It has not always prevented, but there are cases where we have been able to prevent bad deals. So to make it an open, global, universal process in which civil society has also the say, citizens have the say to influence processes. That is what we are asking. It is not a guarantee, but it is at least, it is the only possibility that we can influence a decision in the favor of people and planet. If it's open, otherwise we will be confronted with deals behind the scene, manipulated by business lobby in rich countries. An open process favors public participation and can have the potential of preventing bad deals and promoting good deals. That is the only answer I have. There is no guarantee. But the most important thing is, if you look at the blockade in Addis against the UN tax body, if some influential middle-range countries like Germany, like Norway, would not have stood with the big blockers like the US and the UK, there was a chance of getting it through. So now also, among countries, we can create new alliances, which is not possible within a behind-the-scene OECD making process. But at the UN, there is a possibility of winning over some members of OECD also to think out of the OECD box and think universal, and then support developing countries in their efforts. This is one. The other one is the possibility of mobilizing civil society, global civil society and citizens for a favorable outcome, for a fair outcome.
I would, as you know, I would very much agree with that. I mean, I think it's perhaps worth reflecting, and this is something that frustrated me with the Oxford academic I mentioned, apart from a sort of sense that maybe it might be okay if Africa doesn't have power, which I'm sure he wouldn't have meant, but it felt a bit like that. But it's this idea that, you know, as if we don't have examples of the UN, of that transparency and greater accountability actually delivering quite different outcomes. And we have some very clear ones in climate change, for example, with the US having to really shift its position because of the public opprobrium that it faced. You know, and so if a superpower is moving on something that size in that setting, there may be something to be said for that setting. I guess the other thing we might add, recognizing, you know, Pascal Saint-Amand has just announced his resignation from the OECD after 10 years. And I think perhaps that's a sign, you know, people have different views on how the OECD has sort of done its role for the G20. But I think there's pretty broad consensus that Pascal is a very sharp political operator, and that his work behind the scenes and the Secretariat in bringing countries to an attempted consensus has been extremely slick and effective. What we're seeing now is that even that just hasn't delivered something that will hold. The US is gone. There's a good chance that relatively little will move in the EU, and most other countries outside the OECD are increasingly seeing, you know, the evidence published by the South Centre, by the IMF, by the EU Tax Observatory, even by us at TJN, you know, showing that the revenue gains or even losses particularly for lower income countries are small or non-existent. So, you know, I think you've got this position where we've really tried, you know, the last 10 years has been nothing but banging our heads against the same wall with the OECD and this version of kind of closed doors, lobby-led consensus seeking, and it simply hasn't delivered on what the G20 wanted, never mind the rest of the world. You know, the G20 asked for one thing, which was a better alignment of the taxable profits of multinational companies with the location of their real activity. And the evidence is absolutely clear that that simply hasn't happened after 10 years. And we may not see these reforms ever go any further. And if they did, it's not clear that they would deliver any progress in any case. So I think for OECD countries, as much as for everyone else, it's clear that something else is needed. And what the UN Tax Convention route offers is the chance to negotiate that inclusively, but also transparently, in such a way, as we do, you know, as Tove has said, for so many other aspects of so many other international issues, where countries have competing interests often, but there may also be a positive sum game to be played. The UN has provided the forum for that. So when I see a question like this, in some ways, you want to turn it around and say, well, actually, let's put it back to you. What is so exceptional about tax that this is the one thing that we shouldn't negotiate in a globally inclusive and transparent and broadly accountable to citizens type of way? Why do you think tax doesn't fit this model in particular? And, you know, there's a set of questions there about the power of lobbying and the power of elites, and we know how tax policy making domestically often doesn't deliver the progress against inequalities that we want to see, even where there is a majority, as there almost always is, in favour of lowering inequality. So we have political issues, yes, but I think there's every reason to be optimistic that the UN Tax Convention offers a route through them that the OECD has demonstrably failed to provide. Now, I need to stop talking. I'm sorry, I'm moderating. We are honoured to have two very high-level speakers now to close the session with. Let me thank our expert panelists, Alvin Mosioma, Tove Riding, and Derje Alamayehu, and for your support and all the work that you're doing as the global movement to push this agenda forward. We're now going to hear from two politicians, as I say, the first of whom is the State Secretary in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Norway, Bjorg Sandskjær. Now, Norway, as you'll all know, has really led on this agenda on illicit financial flows, in particular, for decades, and used its political capital and its aid budget in an exceptionally effective way to raise up the set of issues here, including around transparency and accountability, and is now, as far back as I think 2008. Had tabled a proposal for a transparency on convention, a convention on transparency, and now has a government which has a manifesto commitment to a UN tax convention. So let me turn over to Minister Sanshire. We're very honoured to have you with us. Thank you, and delighted to hear your thoughts on the convention and on the prospects for progress. Please.
Sure, thanks, Alex. And let me start by thanking you and the Tax Justice Network for inviting me here today, and not least for many years of excellent cooperation. As you mentioned, this is an area where Norway has been involved for some time, the area of illicit financial flows. I've listened to the panel, thanks to the panel as well, for very clear messages that I certainly have noted and will take with me in the important work that we are moving into. I also heard very clear messages from African colleagues when I participated in the ministerial conference virtually, but the conference in Dakar in May earlier this year. And these messages leave no doubt in me that illicit flows in its many forms have devastating effects on many developing countries, as well as, everywhere really. And what I hear also makes it very clear that the global interlinkages and ramifications of illicit flows require us to come up with a global solution. The African group has called for a UN convention on taxes. Their call, your call, some representatives here, is a result of decades of experience. I believe is something the global community needs to give serious consideration. And I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but clearly the underlying fact is that illicit flows neither respect borders nor law enforcement, has a detrimental effect on institutions, on resource mobilization and governance, and ultimately threatens the very core of our democracy. This has become even more evident in the current context. Rising debt levels, growing inflation in the post-pandemic era that we're moving into, are being exacerbated even further by illicit flows, resources being siphoned away from development finance where it is most needed. So my friends, this is about more than just numbers. Illicit flows threatens our most important currency, which is trust. We are already seeing the consequences. Tax-paying citizens are losing confidence in elected leaders, becoming disillusioned with public institutions and giving way to populist and authoritarian forces. Law-abiding companies find they are unable to compete on a level playing field, and institutions and countries are held captive for political and for private gains. So we believe a global financial system which rewards massive tax evasion is not and can never be sustainable. So we, as an international community, we need to acknowledge that we need to do more to prevent and combat corruption, tax evasion, other financial irregularities, and crime. And we, as politicians, we have a duty to listen to proposals for change. The FACTI panel, for example, that Norway was involved in, made some bold recommendations that merit our serious consideration. In the final report, the panel proposes that we create better taxation rules that address the fragmented landscape in the global fight against illicit flows. And we've heard some strong statements to that effect earlier today as well. We need to raise the bar. We need to demand more of the ongoing work in existing mechanisms in international and legal frameworks. We also need to develop norms and better standards, and we need to do that in an inclusive manner, as several previous speakers today have mentioned. The UN Convention Against Corruption, the UNCAC, is the only legally binding universal anti-corruption instrument, And as we all know, the custodian is UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And it was not easy to get to the UNCAC. Norway is a strong supporter of UNODC and the ongoing assistance to developing countries to accelerate the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption. Similarly, I heard criticism of the OECD here today, but we do believe it's important that we support and build upon efforts by the OECD that are producing some results against tax evasion and base erosion and profit shifting, as well as in global financial institutions. But clearly, despite the progress made in the UNODC and in the OECD track, clear gaps remain. Speakers have illustrated that very clearly today as well. So we believe we need to not shy away from considering proposals for real improvements where these are needed. A convention that builds on progress made in existing mechanisms and aspires to close those gaps could be an important step in this regard. So I believe our aim must be to make our international institutions and frameworks more coordinated, more effective, and investment in international tax systems will reap rewards towards the global level. So in closing, let me also say that similar to the African group, Norway has called for a legally binding convention on these issues, on economic transparency, in which we focus on transparency, on openness, and participation in the global financial system. Transparency, again, so fundamental to building that trust between citizens and government. And in our ambitions to achieve this, we are focused on building alliances within our region as well as across region. It's time now that we translate this political commitment into action. Norway will do all we can to make sure that this happens and give careful consideration to the proposed process on a UN Convention on Taxes in this respect. So I look forward to working with all of you to achieve this common goal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's so encouraging to to hear that commitment. I was going to ask you about the reasons why Norway's championed this issue over decades, but I think you've really spoken to that a lot. So perhaps I'll look ahead. I think we have a sense already that there are strong supporters on this agenda, but there's also potentially quite strong resistance, at least resistance to this proposal for a UN tax convention. I wonder if you're optimistic about the potential for support, particularly in the European region, if there might be the possibility to bring a group of countries to engage positively in this and in the start of negotiations.
Thank you. And yes, absolutely. So we are optimistic, but we are also realistic. We know it won't be easy. We've been working on this for decades and we haven't achieved our goals. So clearly, we need to think about how we build those alliances. And the proposals we are talking about today, as also have been mentioned, do challenge and hold to account economic and political interests that are, let's say, invested in maintaining the current system. So it will take time. We need to work hard, but we are committed to not giving up until we've found that way. And I'm positive that there are others who believe the same, that we will be able to work with.
I very much hope so. And yes, I think we have that sense too. It's as this becomes a more public and publicly discussed issue, we're starting to get different signals, sometimes surprisingly, from countries that there may be support or at least interest in engaging in the discussions where we wouldn't necessarily have expected that. My predecessor used to say, be realistic, ask for the impossible. And in some ways, that's kind of the history of tax justice. This whole set of things that, were impossible, were utopian, from beneficial ownership transparency to multilateral automatic exchange of information, country by country reporting, all delivered, at least to some extent. And now we look at the convention as a way of delivering all of them comprehensively for all countries. I should let the audience know that Minister Ocampo has been delayed until the top of the hour. So what we'll do, if the Minister and panelists are happy with this, is sort of continue our discussion for 15 minutes, and then we'll run over slightly and hear from Minister Ocampo. So perhaps I might ask a question to Tove Riding. I wanted to go back to something in the draft convention. The draft that you put forward, obviously has sort of a full set of detail on a whole range of areas, including the transparency areas I've just touched on. I wonder if you've got a sense of, I know in the past there's been, in some ways, a different, or not a difference, but there've been almost two separate channels, one on transparency measures and one on an intergovernmental tax body. And what this convention does, including your draft, is bring those two together and say, we need to deliver on these transparency and cooperation issues and the architecture around the accountability and monitoring that data and so on. And we need to create the inclusive political space for negotiations. Is your sense that, including from the reactions you've had, that putting those two together makes it easier to convince people this is really the key part of the answer to the problems facing us all? Or alternatively, is there a risk that you combine the forces that would oppose both of these and end up with a harder sell than if you just said, look, we're going to prioritize one because it's too difficult to get it all over the line? What's your sense of that?
Yes, thank you so much, Alex, and also thank you to the Minister also for some really great and important inputs. I think I can combine these two aspects and say what happens when we put transparency up in the UN Tax Convention boat. First of all, we're able to prove what a convention could do, because it is true that there has been some good initiatives on transparency. Automatic information exchange is a great example of where we've seen some good standards. They still need improvement. There's been good standards from the OECD. And we can also see that in most developing countries don't receive any automatic information exchange. They've been left out. And if we look at why did that happen? Well, it's because the OECD's gone back to the system of bilateral agreements being the basis for automatic information exchange. And developing countries are not very strong in bilateral negotiations with, for example, Switzerland. So it's very difficult for them to implement that system. So by showing, imagine if this was truly global, we can actually show how the impact would be much stronger. And at the same time, we would, of course, be taking the good ideas that are there. Also, importantly, by having transparency with a purpose, we can also avoid silly solutions like we've seen on the EU country-by-country reporting, where they include some countries and not others. So it means we get information from Denmark, but we don't get information from Switzerland. It's the information from Switzerland that's important if you want to discover corporate tax avoidance. And the reason why you can have these transparency rules where you think, yes, we'll get data, but we won't get information, is because the transparency needs to be within a purpose. So that's where putting it all into a real context actually makes it easier, in my view, to explain why this is the good way to go.
Thanks, Tove. And I'm delighted that the Colombian Finance Minister, Professor José Antonio Ocampo, has joined us. Thank you very much, Professor Ocampo. We are honoured to have you with us. It's been a really interesting discussion about both the details of what could be in a convention and the politics of how we might get there, following this call from the African finance ministers at the Economic Commission for Africa, but also, of course, the work of the FACTI panel, in which you played a key role. So we'd be, really just delighted to hear your thoughts on the potential for UN tax convention, including perhaps the possibility of support across your region also.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for inviting me to this panel at this important time ahead of the UN General Assembly, and thank the Tax Justice Network for the continuous work you are doing towards a fairer, most just global tax system. And let me excuse myself for having to arrange the timing, but also due to the traffic congestion in Bogota. So I'm sorry about being late for this meeting. Let me say that tax justice has an important role in addressing inequality. As a minister, the first reform I am proposing in Colombia is a tax reform with the double aim of improving equality and tax justice. Progressivity, equity, and efficiency are the principles that the Colombian Constitution places on tax reforms. And this reform will contribute to the funding of a significant social programs supporting social spending in the fight for equality and tax justice. Why are we doing this? Poverty in Colombia is a structural problem which translates into the inability for too many people being unable to access fundamental goods and services. The indicators of extreme poverty put Colombia above countries like Ecuador, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Peru. 1 in 10 people in Colombia today struggle to put food on the table, a problem exacerbated by the current increase in inflation. This is simply unacceptable, and we're going to change this. We are one of the most unequal countries in the region and the world, above Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and the tax system I have inherited plays a significant part in driving up this inequality. The current tax system is extremely favorable to taxpayers with higher income and those who derive their income from capital, and this goes against both the principles of vertical and horizontal equity. Rich people are able to exploit tax avoidance opportunities, which reduces the progressive nature of our tax system. This is because we have a tax system that favors the rich, those who earn rents from capital, but not the workers. The reform I am proposing is built on the 3 constitutional principles: progressivity, equity, and efficiency, aimed at eradicating hunger, reducing poverty, and dismantling the tax system that benefits only the wealthier in our society. The reform will reduce the tax benefits for higher income segments of society and introduce a wealth tax. Both elements will generate revenues for social spending, prioritizing the pillars of education, health, and environmental protection. Overall, the reform is expected to reduce poverty by 4 percentage points, as well as income inequality, when we take into account the redistributive effects of the additional social spending. People all over the world are suffering as a result of high inflation, and Colombia is no different. But at the same time, some companies are making excess profits, particularly in the energy and commodity sector, including the case of Colombia oil and coal exporters. The rents coming from the exploitation of natural resources should be seen as a mechanism of redistribution towards the most vulnerable. This is why we are planning to introduce a 10% tax on extraordinary export revenues for companies that are benefiting from the high commodity prices. Many countries like Spain, Italy, and the UK have introduced similar measures to capture the extra profits that some companies are benefiting from. Windfall taxes can be justified when it is reasonable that those driving up tax legislation did not foresee extreme circumstances that subsequently make them necessary. Finally, as part of our reform, we will improve the progressivity of the system by introducing clear rules for digital companies to the establishment of a significant economic present principle. A simple rule so that if you are a digital company providing services to Colombian customers, then above a certain threshold of sales in the country, you start paying taxes. And this brings me directly to the issues of global tax rules, who makes the rules, and how the rules should be reformed. I was a member of the high-level panel on international financial accountability, transparency, and integrity for achieving the 2030 agenda, the FACTI panel. And I specifically look at the issues of how the current international tax systems results in an annual significant global revenue losses due to tax evasion and avoidance, and how this is failing to deliver the meaningful revenues to meet the 2030 agenda. Financial integrity and transparency are paramount to the success of the 2030 agenda, and the FACTI panel report provides a blueprint for addressing some of the challenges preventing us from achieving these goals. We already have a complex web of agreements, initiatives, programs, conventions, and treaties, both within and apart from the United Nations, that have developed to address different aspects on financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. Each instrument addresses part of the problem, but not in a systemic way. But there are also many questions around inclusion, implementation, and enforcement, especially given the limited capacity of many of the most severely affected jurisdictions. The prevailing dissatisfaction with these arrangements, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, eviscerated public finances and confidence in the system, in what led to the convening of the FACTI panel in 2020. In writing our report, we noticed a double theft. First, massive tax evasion, but also the fact that it robs millions of people of a better future, access to basic infrastructure and services, and condemns them to a life in poverty. The problem is systemic and requires a systemic set of solutions. This is why we put together 14 recommendations that, if implemented, will go a long way in filling the gaps in financing the SDGs, so that we can deliver a better system of development, but also peace and prosperity. A key part of the recommendations, and the one we are here to discuss today, is a proposal for a UN tax convention to address the needs of a global minimum tax, digital taxation, and capital gains, among other things. The UN tax convention should ensure that multinationals pay their fair share of taxes, and this requires a fair approach to addressing transfer pricing issues that disproportionately undermine revenues generation in developing countries. The current system of transfer pricing based on the arm's length principle is no longer fit for today's economy and merits adjustment. A simple and fair formulaic approach to taxing rights should be adopted based on total profits of multinational corporations as a group. This should be supported by an effective minimum tax of 25%. The proposal for formulary apportionment of multinational global profits and a global minimum tax of 25% are also proposals of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, ICRIT, which I chaired for many years. A special attention should be given to the schemes used to avoid capital gains taxes. In other words, measures should be implemented to constrain the ability of companies to use offshore indirect transfers, which involve ownership changes of corporations that own assets being recorded in a different jurisdiction from the asset itself. On the other hand, fair taxation of digitalized economic activities requires equitable treatment of digital businesses and business models with traditional business. The formulaic approach to taxing rights described above should help achieve these and additional proposals to allow taxation of automated digital services should be adopted by the UN Tax Convention. Many countries have implemented unilateral measures to tax digital businesses, and I am proposing to do the same in Colombia by introducing a new significant economic principle on digital tax. Incorporating many of the above proposals in the UN Tax Convention will create a multilateral framework based on international agreements, and they enable additional countries to start taxing the digital economy with realistic proposals of obtaining substantial revenues. A number of these proposals will require changes to the domestic legislation, as well as a more uniform adoption of the relevant treaty provisions. The UN Tax Convention can help facilitate this universally and with greater speed. Finally, how the rules are made is almost as important as the rules themselves. And this is why an intergovernmental tax committee in the UN is required. The international committee should explore that international norms enjoy the highest level of legitimacy by providing a level playing field in a negotiating process that has universal participation. Ensuring legitimacy in international norms through a more inclusive process that takes into account countries' needs and context will foster a sense of ownership and incentive implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very aware that we're a little over time, but I think people will stay with us if we have time for just one or two quick questions. And it's, what you lay out for Colombia is, both ambitious and inspiring, and, feels as if it really points the way to what, if multilaterally adopted, would be the type of UN tax convention that would really dramatically change the context in which we all operate. But I wonder if you are optimistic about the possibility of gaining wider support within the region across Latin America for this type of agenda.
Well, let me say in that regard that the inclusive framework of G20 OECD base erosion and profit shifting was a step forward, a limited one, however, and therefore that the corporate minimum corporate tax of 15% was perhaps too limited relative to the 25% that we proposed in FACTI and ICRIC, and particularly the allocation of the global profits multinationals for developing countries was extremely limited. Therefore, there is a strong interest to pave the way for sweeping reforms that will be more favorable for countries like Colombia. This is why we are in our country proposing to introduce a new significant economic present principle and the digital service tax that I mentioned in my previous presentation. Now, whether there is an agreement to go into more ambitious reform, and particularly to a UN tax committee and a UN tax convention, is something that I think so far has not been the subject of discussion among Latin American countries, relative to I guess, to the very positive statement in this regard by the African countries. But let me say that I will try to propose this idea to the ECLAC meeting, the Economic Commission for Latin America, to follow the steps that were taken by the African countries. And I think we'll probably have an agreement in that regard to go towards a UN tax convention and a UN tax committee. Let me perhaps remember one little thing about the current tax committee. When I was the head of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and therefore the UN and the Secretary General, I was actually in charge of upgrading the tax committee, which at the time I was surprised that it had been ad hoc for more than half a century. So we turned it into a regular committee, and I actually proposed that it should be an intergovernmental organ, under ECOSOC, of course, But the intergovernmental character was not approved at that time. It was only made an expert committee, but at least a permanent expert committee. I was very positively surprised that in the Addis Ababa Conference on Financing for Development, 2015, actually the G77 brought the same proposal to create this UN Intergovernmental Committee on international tax cooperation, but it was rejected actually by particularly, I think particularly the US and the UK were against that idea. But I think there is a possibility now, given the current conditions, of moving into a broader and better system with, probably the UN rather than OECD at the center. Thank you.
Thank you again, and look, as I say, it's been inspiring to hear the leadership that you and Colombia are showing on this. I think for our wider audience, there's perhaps two things that we might take away from this. One is just this sense that there is a lot of support now for the idea. The momentum has built over the last couple of years in particular, although with this kind of couple of decades tail also, and across different regions. And that's both a very positive demand for better and for more inclusive than what we have, but also recognition of the failings of the OECD alternatives, even whereas, as you've said, Minister, there has been some elements of progress in what's been done, this sense that it's not the body that's going to get us all the way there. So we are looking forward to the possibility that a resolution may be tabled at the UN General Assembly that could begin negotiations on a UN convention. And I would urge the audience here and those reading media coverage of this event later to consider whether their countries are supportive or have even expressed a public position yet on the convention, because it's by asking that question of our own governments that we can start to move this forward. We heard earlier from Alvin Musioma of Tax Justice Network Africa the extraordinary degree of support from civil society around the world that the sign-on statement following the African Minister's declaration has had. So we know there is wide and deep engagement on this. The question starts to feel not, could this ever happen, but how quickly can we now move this forward? And I think it's looking to the various regions and thinking also within the OECD where the supporters might be, in addition to Colombia, of course. So with that, let me thank everyone, including State Secretary Sancha and Minister Ocampo, again, for your contributions, and our panel, Alvin Musioma, Tova Riding, and Derege Almayehu. There's a lot more to be said about this and a lot more discussions that I think will start right now. But I hope this event has put down a bit of a marker. The UN Tax Convention has gone from a utopian dream to a quite realistic, even pragmatic possibility, perhaps even within quite a short term from now. That's certainly an area that we'll be pushing, because as has been said, it's not just about making the rules and standards work better for everyone. It's about making sure everyone has a voice in setting them. That in itself is an important part of the architectural change that the convention could deliver. Lastly, just to say, we will have the videos with different languages up as soon as we possibly can, probably tomorrow, and look forward to continuing this discussion with all of you over the next weeks and months. And finally, thanks to the Global Alliance for Tax Justice for partnering with us in this event, and indeed, I hope in the push for a convention as we go forward now. With that, thank you all. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you may be.